Yo, have you seen the flash simulator barrel for the King Tiger? Where? Over there? Hang on. This one? That's not a flash simulator barrel. Now that is a flash simulator barrel. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for this 1/6 scale Armortek German King Tiger heavy tank. Since the last video update, a lot of progress has been made to the tank's internal electronics, as well as more notably the vehicle's turret and main tube detailing. We'll be going over all of this information in this video, so stay tuned because there's going to be a ton of info coming right at you. The next bit of equipment that I'm going to be securing to the model at this point are the smoke system refueling pumps. This vehicle, of course, does have a smoke system in it, and unlike the smaller scale 1/16 builds, where you use gravity in order to top off the smoke system, for the Armorteks here, it's a bit more demanding because of the larger size as well as the location of the smoke system. The smoke system, of course, is located in the heart of the model, and if you just have a simple gravity system, it might not get the fluid where it needs to go. So the pump is going to be really helpful with doing that. This is a system, by the way, that I've incorporated for many, many years, and it's something that's basically been a staple on my builds ever since I first started doing this. I'm pretty sure some individuals out there are looking at this and saying, yeah, that's overly complicated. You don't need to have that inside of your build. Well, it also has a secondary effect. Outside of refueling the smoke system in an efficient manner, it also allows you to refuel the smoke system with the bottle away from the model. And this becomes important because the smoke fluid can possibly hurt the finish, specifically if it's exposed to it often. Generally on my builds, I have a spigot found on the model at one point or in some location or another, and this allows you to connect a tube, which of course will be supplied, and then this tube can connect to, well, this smoke fluid. This allows the smoke fluid to flow through the tube, into the tank, into the smoke system, without the need of dangling that really big smoke fluid bottle over your model, which if your aim is off, you're going to spill it and, again, cause harm to the finish. One final benefit that this setup also has is that this gives back pressure to the refueling spout. As we saw in the other video where I assembled the smoke system, there are these two, or I should say there's this one spout that is used for the refueling purpose. Well, because the unit is fan blown, the smoke will want to exit from the location that is used for the smoke system refueling. If you have the pump over here, this is going to prevent the smoke from backing out and just bleeding off into the model. And this also has a secondary effect of focusing all of the fan's output to blow out through the exhaust manifolds, which is where the smoke needs to be emitted from this vehicle. To do this, I'm using my tried and true Habaco top refueler. These systems here, for a while, were extremely plentiful and were able to be found just about anywhere, like from Tower Hobbies or Amazon and anywhere else in between. Unfortunately, it seems like these units are becoming a bit scarce and harder to find. These two units I picked up off of eBay, and I did a quick Google search, and yeah, it seems like these units are, I don't think, in production anymore, so that's kind of a bummer. Fortunately, I did find a alternative solution to this, and it can be found in the video description listed below. It's an Amazon link, and the seller does have a few of these units on stock, and they're for pretty decent prices. But these ones here, yeah, it looks like the sun's setting on them, which is a pity too, because they are actually extremely good quality. The units are 12-volt powered, so patching into the tank's power supply is not going to be an issue. And I'm going to make some modifications to this unit in order to better suit the refueling needs. Also, you'll notice that there are not one but two of these pumps sitting on the table. Well, this is because this vehicle is unique in that it has two smoke systems as opposed to the one which is generally seen on these Armortek kits. Because of the two systems, I'm going to have an independent pump for both of those. This may seem to be adding extra complexity because I was thinking on possibly having just one pump, but having one pump offers some problems. First, you need to possibly fill up one smoke reservoir as opposed to the other, and if you just fill them both up at the same time, this can lead to issues because you can overfill the system or on one of the units in a much more haphazard way. Another option was to have one pump but with a valve type system where you can select which smoke system to refuel. But again, in my opinion, that just adds some added complexity and it's just one less thing you need to fiddle with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to utilize a 2-pump setup, but they are going to be connected to the same switch. So when it comes time for refueling the unit, you can just plug your rubber tube into the spigot that needs to be refueled, turn on the power, and it'll just automatically refuel it. The other unit will just be piggybacking for the ride, and if that one needs to be topped off, you just put the spigot on the other refill spout and top the fuel tank, or I should say the smoke fluid tank, as again, once need be. In order to do this modification, well, first I need to take it out of the packaging here. With the way these refuelers come, they have these little alligator clips on them. These are not going to be needed, so I'm going to be snipping them off, and I'm going to be connecting both of the units together. With both units connected together, I will then have 2 wires to patch into the switch as well as into the power supply, which I'm going to be touching upon also in this video. And here we have the 2 pumps mounted to the model. In addition to securing the pumps, I also went ahead and added this little bit of extra equipment over here. And this is actually something that's really important in case you want to add extra functions to your Armortek outside of what the stock kit gives you. If anyone has ever watched my older builds, you'll notice that I've utilized this little bit of equipment in the past. It's a small little circuit board here with a dimmer switch on it, and I use this primarily for controlling the cooling fan animations that are found on the rear of the vehicle. I've also used them in the past to control the engine throttle found on the detailed animated engines. The system was very easy to hook up, and it does work, and it did work apparently for a period of time. However, one of my associates reached out to me and has a system very similar to this, and he told me that although the system did work, it did eventually burn out, and when this burned out, he actually fried some of his cooling fan details. So he went ahead and did a little research, and it turns out that these things have an Achilles heel on them where they eventually do burn out when subject to 24-volt load, which is of course what the main power is. He went ahead and patched me into this system. What this system is, this is a volt reducer. This will take the 24 volts coming from the raw power and step it down to 12 volts, which will then be able to power the other electronics. This system here is still going to be utilized, although it's going to be patched into this system over here where only 12 volts are going to be pumped into this as opposed to the 24, and the 12 volts should be able to keep this thing from fizzing out. I do want to stress, by the way, that these things are advertised to take more than 24 volts, so I'm just going to chalk it up to the pieces being made in China on that one. So, although the pieces are great, in order to use them, it would behoove you to grab one of these pieces over here. These things, fortunately, are really easily obtained and are very affordable. This one here was picked up off of Amazon.com. The link is listed below, and by the way, as are the links for these. This is what they look like when you get them. They come in this little conveniently sealed box, and they are really easy to hook up. As you can see, the instructions are really straightforward. Red and black go to the battery, and the black and yellow found on the opposite side of the unit go to the device of your choice. In order to patch it in the last video, I'll just skew the camera over. In the last video, I hooked up a junction box right here specifically for the purpose of animations. Well, in order to patch the unit in, I simply just tied this into this system. So this is feeding the box, and then the other 2 wires here are going to this little terminal box, and this is where the accessories are going to plug to. At the moment, the only bit of equipment I have plugged in at this point are the 2 refueling pumps that I touched upon earlier. As for the pumps themselves, they are controlled via this switch that we have here on the control panel. If I turn the tank on and hit the switch, you clearly hear the pumps in operation. Also, you notice that they are a lot quieter compared to some of my earlier builds, and that's because of the 12-volt reducer mechanism that I just touched upon. So the thing is definitely working as advertised. To secure the unit in place, this was also very easily done. I just piggybacked off of the one fastener that we have on the side here for securing on the sponsons. All that was done was I just swapped out the fastener for a slightly longer one, and then the unit was bolted in place with just the addition of a small washer. This was more than enough to keep this thing at bay. At this time, I also patched in the radio. The radio that I'm using at the moment is this FlySky 6-channel radio, although I think I might change this out because I don't think there are enough channels on it in order to have all of the functions that I plan on putting into this build. 6 channels is really all you need for just the standard stock Armortek kit, but if you want to go outside of that and have other things, you're going to need at least 8 channels or so. So this is something that may be subject to change as the build progresses, but we'll see for certain. Right now the radio is patched in and all of the main Armortek functions are present with the exception of the flash system, which I'll touch upon in another video. So the main drive, the elevation, the turret rotation, and the sound system are currently all live. The piggyback systems are patched in as well. This would include the smoke system and the animations for the periscope, as well as the bound machine gun. Back to the sound system. In the last video, I hooked up the amplifier unit, but I wasn't able to test the system because I didn't have the radio patched in at that time. Well, with the radio patched in, I was able to get the sound system to fire up. Although right now, it's a bit rudimentary because I need that knob encoder switch thing that's going to need to be added to the radio in order to unlock the other sound systems that are on the file, like the main gun, the recoil, the commander, all that good stuff. That you need the Benedetti encoder for. So right now we're going to see again how that pans out as the build progresses, but at least I can test the system right now. So you can hear this thing fire up for the first time. Currently the tank is on, and I'm going to trigger the sound system by manipulating this knob over here. This is the first time in this series that the sound system is going to be fired up and caught on camera. The volume is not really set all that high at the moment in order to just preserve my hearing, as this thing can get really loud, and when I'm in the shop setting over here, it can become a bit intrusive. So the sound setting is going to be about a quarter of the way there, but I can still fire up the sound system right now. So that was engine startup and engine idle. I also have engine throttle, but right now it's not patched into the actual controls for the sticks. So if I drive the model, it's not going to change the sound system file in any way. This is something, of course, that needs to be done as the build progresses. And I also have the engine kill sound effect. So, obviously, there's going to be a bit of room for improvement on that, but, you know, you need to crawl before you walk, and this is a really good step forward in that direction. Like I stated before, the servos are patched into the system in a piggyback format right now, and I mentioned this servo in the last video, which was for the bound machine gun pivot. Well, this is currently patched into the turret rotation, so that when the vehicle's operating and you rotate the turret, you're going to get a secondary animation of the bound machine gun pivoting. Let's see what it looks like from the outside. One last thing I want to touch upon involving the servo involves the clevis and the mounting plate that we have here. In the last video, I stated that this unit is removable in case you need to get access to the equipment below this plate. And if that happens, you need to reline up where the servo plate needs to be in order to get the correct motion found on the MG. Well, this is facilitated with this arrow that I drew right here on the top plate. This arrow indicates where this rivet needs to line up in order for the piece to be centered and to get the full effect of the left and right hand motion. If this is set in one direction or in one setting too far to the left or right, it's going to throw off exactly how much the machine gun ball can pivot. So this is something definitely to keep in mind. The other periscope pivoting feature, this is not as important as the WWII one that we have here. Outside of the refill system, the smoke system is currently patched into the RC system, and it is fully live. The system works as per the kit right now, so if I actually turn the tank on and give it a little bit of throttle, this smoke system is going to actuate and output some smoke. Let's see what it looks like in action. With the hull functions basically coming to the end, this leads us to the final frontier function-wise on this build, and that involves the components in the turret. Because there are so many components involved with the functions I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to have to basically go over this in 2 or 3 segments. So, segment number 1, here we have the bulk of the big, heavy components, leading us to the largest object, which is the mantlet. The mantlet found on the Armortek King Tiger really is a work of art. This and the front armor plate are probably my 2 favorite aspects of this entire build. The mantlet itself is all made from a single aluminum casting, which is sublime. Because of this material here, the need to add cast texturing or any sort of other surface imperfections or texturing detailing is just not necessary. You could just take this thing out of the box, paint it, and proceed with the installation. All of the appropriate details are integrally molded in, namely the step sections that we have here, as well as this ring portion. All of these details are something that you're just not going to have to worry about as the builder. And that's also true for this ring running around this section. The unit, of course, is pre-machined, and these fastener locations here are tapped. I'm going to be going over more in depth on these fasteners in a minute, because this is actually one of the cooler aspects of the King Tiger, and again, we'll see as the video progresses. But you can also see how much of the machining is done on the inside portion on these recesses. This is something that differs from the older generation of Armortek King Tiger kits. The reason why the older generation units had a slightly different machining to this part here involved the functionality of the piece. You see, the older generation of Armortek King Tigers were actually one of the last Armortek production kits to feature the capability of mounting the blank firing system, the Armortek specific blank firing system. The blank firing system is actually something that came up in a recent thread on the Armortek USA Facebook page, and I chimed in a little bit on my thoughts on it. Basically, a lot of people out there, they feel that the blank firing system is something that should still be offered as an option, and they were kind of disappointed when Armortek discontinued that item, or that feature, and having worked on one of those systems, I could definitively say you're really not missing out on much. Those systems, they were pretty ambitious, but they really left a lot of room for improvement, and it's for the best that Armortek actually discontinued them. If anyone wants to know more about that blank firing system, I actually have a video on the ECA channel where I describe the unit in more depth, and I actually build one, and I show how it works, or I should say more or less the lack thereof, the actual function of it. However, fast forward to this kit over here. When Armortek dropped the blank firing feature, they went ahead and came up with a new system, which was a simulated flash and recoil system. Basically, it's just a gigantic version of what we see on the 1/16 scale Tamiya kits, as well as even on the Tegan models as well. This type of system is one that have been used on Armortek kits from the 2011 timeframe up until the present day. Granted, the system has gone through some evolutionary steps in the years that followed the initial release, but regardless, that's how the Armortek kits are set up to be assembled these days. In order to do this, we have extra machining done on the inside portions here of the mantlet, and this has to do with the bushing setup that I'm going to be touching upon once I start going over all these pieces in more depth. So anyway, back to the mantlet here. You can see that the one area that I am going to clean up a little bit is this ring. A little bit of the sand apparently must have broke off of the pattern when they were making the mold, leading for this type of an appearance. This is something I'm going to clean up, and it's one that's not really too uncommon, specifically when you're dealing with sand casted components like this one here, but this is something I'm going to look forward to digging into. And since I knocked the component over, I might as well discuss it. This here is obviously the muzzle brake, and while on the muzzle brake, this takes us to the main gun barrel. The barrel itself is a single piece of CNC'd aluminum. It's very nicely detailed. It has all of the appropriately scaled sections to it, namely right here on the front portion. Note it has the groove as well as with the little machined in divots that we see here. The other grooves are in their appropriate locations. and the barrel does have its taper to it. It does have some very fine machining marks on it. If I go up and down with my finger, you can probably hear the little zipper noise. The machining marks are extremely fine, so much so that you don't necessarily need to sand it down with some sandpaper, but this is something I'll be touching upon again as the video progresses. The unit is pre-threaded on both the rear and the inner portion here on the front end. And overall, it's a very nice bit of equipment and builds very easily. On the muzzle brake itself, it is also a single piece of CNC turning. It's pre-threaded in the back here to just simply thread onto the barrel without any problems. The muzzle brake itself has the appropriate shape and geometry like I just touched upon. However, it's a bit basic in the remainder of the detailing, which would include the baffle rings, which are found on the, or would be found on the inner portions over here. There are some wrenchlets found on the front, and most importantly, there's the locking tab found on the top. Of course, I'm going to be modifying this component to have these details in this video, so stay tuned for that. With the barrel out of the way, this leads us to the remainder of the components on the table. This chunk of turning right here is the front trunnion. This is the pivot point that the mantlet is going to be able to elevate and to press on. It's made from a single turning of CNC'd aluminum. It's pre-drilled and tapped and just bolts directly to the turret itself. In this bag over here, we have the barrel trunnion mounts. These are made from 2 solid pieces of CNC brass stock. And again, just like with the other components, they are pre-drilled and tapped. Along with the brass blocks, these 2 pivot pegs here are what connect the barrel to said blocks, and they are just comprised out of 2 sections of CNC'd steel. They're very strong and are pre-tapped, and they fit directly onto the brass mounting blocks that I just mentioned. They are nicely machined, and in the past I've had some really good results with using these. The next bit of equipment is this threaded section that we have here. This fitting connects to the motor, and because of the threads, this is actually what gives the power to elevate and depress the tube. You'll notice that the threads are cut into this turning over here, and with the way the system works, this will rotate and a cog section will slide up and down with the thread. Since the cog is hooked up to a cam, when the unit goes left and right, it will actually do this type of a motion with the trunnion, giving you the elevation and depression. It's a very simple system, and again, because it's CNC'd steel, it is extremely robust, and this thing is pretty much bomb-proof. While on the camming section, this here is the cam block. Again, just a simple piece of laser-cut steel that has been stamped to the shape that we have here. Note the cam groove found on the inside. And on that note, here we have the actual cam, or I should say the cam pin. It is comprising of a single piece of CNC brass. The inner portion here is tapped to go up and down that threaded rod that I just touched upon. This end cap here is also made out of CNC brass, and will simply just bolt to this section over here, keeping it in place, which will then focus all of the energy from the threads to go in this type of a motion up and down this cam, which will, of course, elevate and press the main tube. Armortek has been using this system for quite a while now. If anyone's a fan of my other Armortek build videos, this setup here should look very familiar. The system, I always thought worked pretty well, and we're going to see how well that pans out once the model heads off into construction. This piece here is the bushing. It's a CNC'd bit of black nylon, and basically this gives a bearing type surface for the tube to slide in during the recoil animation. It cuts down on the friction, and it's something that have been seen on the recent Armortek releases, specifically when they adopted the recoil animation system. This is one of the units. There is another unit that I'm going to touch upon in a moment that's slightly smaller, but it's the same type of design as this one here. In this little bag, we have the bracket which secures the recoil plate to the side portion of the trunnion. It's made out of a very thick piece of CNC'd aluminum. And on, I should say, in this bubble wrap bag that we have here, we have the actual recoil bracket. This is a slightly different design compared to the earlier units. If anyone recalls from those other builds, in the past this was one piece of laser cut steel that was bent in a L bracket type format, and there's still that cutout here to mount on the recoil servo. Even though it's a slightly different design, it looks like it's more than robust for the job at hand. Note the thickness of the piece here. It's about 1/8 of an inch thick of steel plate, which is also true for the other steel components I just touched upon. And yeah, we'll see how this one goes together. We have here another component, which is a steel bracket. This is also, I believe, to connect that component that I just mentioned to those other two pieces. And again, stamp piece, 1/8 of an inch steel. It should be more than robust enough for doing the animation without it bending out of shape. This bag here is just a plethora of fasteners of all different shapes and sizes. No real point to go into that. So now that the tabletop is cleaned off, let me go ahead and prep it with the second batch of parts that are going to be needed in order to fulfill this portion of the build. And here's part 2 of the parts breakdown. These parts here are specifically more focused on the recoil animation as opposed to the other parts that I touched upon before. For the recoil, here we have another bushing. This one here is, again, made out of a white nylon as opposed to the black nylon that I touched upon before. And again, it's going to be interesting to see how this fits into the mantlet. We have another bag here full of assorted fasteners, but that's not really that important. What is important are the remainder of the parts here on the table. Sealed in this pink bubble wrap bag is the recoil module itself. The recoil module is responsible for 2 things. First, it's obviously in charge of actuating the servo to pull the tube backward and return it home again. And it's also in charge of having the flash simulator trigger prior to the animation sequence taking over. The unit consists of one little box that we have here with the appropriate connectors, and this will patch into the, I believe, the sound system as well as the secondary speed controller box that is found on the option pack, and it's something that I already installed on this vehicle, and I mentioned it in the previous videos. Moving on, takes us to this little aluminum tube that we have here. It is threaded. This connects the animation system for the servo with the main tube setup. We'll see how this mounts on. This here is a very high powerful servo from the company Servo, Savix, I don't know how to pronounce it, but anyway, it's from this company. The servos have been issued on these systems for a while now, and I can say that they are very nicely engineered. These are high-quality servos, not your basic El Cheapo Futabas that we see on the market. So the servo itself, I believe, is ball bearing assisted, if I'm not mistaken, but it does have a nice aluminum casing to it, which is something that's higher quality compared to some of the other systems that are out there. We also have here an aftermarket aluminum clevis arm. This just mounts to the servo, and we'll see how that looks once everything is mounted. For the actuator, we have this giant hex portion of CNC brass. It is hollow to force the flash bulbs through, and you can see it has a slot milled in as well as a fastener hole in order to secure on the clevis. The clevis, if you're asking, is this section that we have here. It's just a piece of laser cut steel that's been pre-drilled out. Finally, this bag here consists of the LED loom, which is what gives you the flash animation, which would be patched also into the sound system. Here you can see what it looks like. We have a cluster of very bright LEDs and a few wire leads which will be connected to that box I touched upon before. And the last 2 bits of equipment are found here on the table. What we have here is a geared electric motor, as well as this umbilical cord, or what's known in the Armortek racket, the Sub-loom. The motor here is pretty self-explanatory on what it does. This is going to tie into that geared section that I touched upon earlier, and is going to give you the power to elevate and do the depression. The Sub-loom is a very long umbilical cord. It comes pre-wired to the configuration you see it here, and has a nice length to it. Basically, this is what's going to connect the turret functions to the functions and control boxes that are located in the hull of the vehicle. All of the Armortek kits have a Sub-loom to them. However, the design of the Sub-loom has changed over the years with the addition or the changes of the main motion pack systems that have occurred over time. This one here is an older unit, and you can tell that because of both the pattern of plug, as well as on the other end, the plug pattern, and most importantly, the limit switches. This design has changed since this rendition that we have here, where the more recent editions removed the limit switches. What the limit switches do, there are these 2 lever actuated cherry switches, and basically these prevent any sort of damage from the barrel overextending either in the down or the upward state. They will secure onto the bracket, which will then be mounted to the turret, and when the barrel hits a certain point, it'll hit the switch, killing the motor, preventing it from going in this direction any further. The only way the motor can go is in the reverse direction, to which then it'll let off this switch, and eventually will bottom out, hitting the other one there, repeating the cycle. Everything comes pre-wired to the way you see it here, and it's basically ready for installation out of the box. Along with the limit switches, the Sub-loom has two other connections to it that are, again, pre-wired. We have this 2-pin connector plug as well as this 2-pin connector plug. Obviously, this one here was plugged directly into the motor, so I was able to test it, which was done off-screen, but again, I'll show that as the video progresses. And this one here was actually used for the blank firing system. The Sub-loom that we have here is blank firing system capable, and again, even though the blank firing system was discontinued for a number of years, they still kept the Sub-loom design that we have until very recently when they decided to upgrade the entire system. If your vehicle does not have the blank firing system, this plug here is basically just a dead system and it's just basically an appendix. However, if you're clever enough, you could probably adapt it for some other function that can be found in the turret of your model. And that's, well, pretty much it. The only other thing I want to mention is that if you have one of these older systems, they do work very well. In fact, I kind of preferred this older system to the newer one in regards to the limit switches. Rather than using this system, on the newer design units, they have a plug which bridges the Sub-loom to the motor, and I'm not really sure how it works, but it's basically a plug with a resistor connected on the end. I presume it detects if the motor is under any strain, so it detects if the system is bottoming out. If it does, I believe it kills the power to the motor, somehow making it only go in the reverse direction. I'm not really sure how the system works. In my opinion, honestly, I prefer the limit switch system. One advantage that the limit switch system has is that you can fine-tune the barrel system to go up and down to a position where you deem fit. Why this is important? Well, let's just say for a vehicle like the Tiger I, for instance, where you have that front plate section that emerges from the deck, as well as on an early Tiger specifically, those two headlights found on the bow section. With this system here, you can calibrate it so that the barrel will stop before it makes contact with either the front plate or possibly in a way where it won't hit those two Bosch light details that are found on your hull. With the newer system, I'm not sure if that's something that can actually be done. So, and there's also something to be said about simplicity. These units here, they literally just work. And I never really had any problems with them in the past. It's, again, it's one of those things where, in my opinion, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But, the new systems do work, and they do work very well to Armortek's credit. It's just, I guess I'm a stodged person who doesn't want change, and again, if it works, right? Back to the model here, the only other time I actually encountered anything wrong with the system was on a number of builds ago. I think it was on my late production Tiger commission build that I was doing. One of these plugs were actually faulty on the limit switches, and I don't know, it was just a weird one. I contacted Armortek, and they just sent me a brand new Sub-loom within a matter of days. I had the new unit, and it worked absolutely flawlessly. So Armortek always had some pretty good customer rapport, and I don't believe that's changed too much since the new ownership has taken over the company. So with that in mind, if you have a system like this and it's not working, you should give them a email, and they should be able to help you out. And of course, one of the most important things that needs to be fitted to the model in order to get the unit assembled involves this little bubble bag that we have here, and this involves the trunnion. The component itself is machined from a single piece of CNC'd aluminum, and it has all of its holes present for the various items that need to be mounted and secured to this piece. The main pivot screw holes are internally tapped, and so the bolts just go directly into their place, holding the unit where it needs to be and allowing it to pivot. With the inside recesses, you can see where the sections are milled away to allow those bushings that I touched upon earlier to be mounted. The first step is to mount the trunnion blocks here to the trunnion itself. That's secured by these two bolts that I touched upon before. And one trick that I like to do to these bolts prior to the installation is with a quick smear of grease, I go ahead and apply it to the middle section here of the fastener itself. You don't want to put it on the threads because this is where you need to Loctite it to the unit, but this section over here is a bearing surface and it's where the unit will actually rotate. So it would be best to go ahead and add just a little smear grease to these locations just to ensure that the piece has a little bit of lubrication on it, which will assist with the elevation and the pressing of the main barrel. Of course, this technique is done to both of these little bolts. And once they have the grease on them, they are ready for installation. For the installation, you need to slide them into the brass block. There is no set direction that these need to go in, so it's one of those things where you can't really screw it up. So just drop the things into place, like so. Okay. At that point there, we can go ahead and add a little bit of Loctite. I'm going to use blue on this. It's not really important, really, which color, but as long as you have a little bit of thread lock on, it's really all that matters. Once you have the stuff in its appropriate location, is at that time there where we could secure these to their appropriate locations. With the way they're machined, it may take a little bit of fiddling in order to get the threads to line up, but once they do and find their little sweet spot, they just thread directly into place. The next part of the install involves the nylon bushing. The nylon bushing goes into this milled recess that we have right here, found on the rear trunnion. The pieces are nicely machined, but if you look at the tolerances, you'll see that they are slightly too tight, where the piece just won't fit inside. This is something that is common on most of these builds, and it's something that needs a little bit of hand fitting prior to the installation, which is not necessarily a bad thing because you actually want the tolerances to be nice and tight so that the piece doesn't just pop off during the recoil animation that's found on this model. In order to get the piece to fit, you can do it in one of two ways. First, you can take the nylon and put it into your lathe, and you can remove just a slight bit amount of material from the surface until the piece just drops right in. However, my lathe jaw chucks is way too small for it to fit a capacity like this one here. So I'm going to have to go with the other option, which is basically to do it by hand by taking a Dremel with a sandpaper drum on it and removing just a slight bit amount of material found on the recess that we have right over here. This I am going to do by hand, and like I stated on a few other techniques which were very similar to this one, you have to be very cautious so that when you're removing the material, you're going in a nice even manner, and you don't want to accidentally go in a oblong format, which can throw off the alignment of the centric hole that we have right here going down the entire stem. Also, like with the other procedures, this is the type of thing you're going to want to do in bursts, where you go in with a pass. When you're done, test fit to see the piece, how it fits, and then you just adjust accordingly. Eventually, you should have just enough material removed for the piece to slide into its appropriate location. While I was grinding down the material, I was making some headway, but you know what? I had a small little light bulb moment, and I saw that the diameter here of the material needs to be removed is actually very similar to the one here found on these fiberglass cutting stones. If I just go ahead and line it up, you can see that it fits almost perfectly, which is actually great because without a whole lot of wiggle room, you could remove a very finite amount of material. So much so that this will be the first step, and then if you need to, you could go back to the sandpaper drum in order for it to finish the remainder of the polishing. So let's go ahead and see how well this works. we're getting there. Let me just go ahead and do the rest off camera, and then we'll cut across to when this has been completed. Okay, it's looking good. I'm not going to put it in just yet, because I'm going to put a little bit of super glue around the edge, and then with a rubber mallet, I'll be able to firmly seat the bushing in its appropriate location. Alright, that should do it. The next leg of the install is going to involve mounting on the various brackets for the elevation system, the restrictor system, as well as the recoil servo. But before I go ahead and do that, the next most important thing, and this is important to keep in sequence, is to secure this to the turret. The reason why this needs to be done at this time here involves these fasteners. You see, once you start mounting these components in their appropriate locations, you're not exactly going to have a whole lot of access to secure the fasteners in their proper place. So this is why this is best done after this unit is mounted inside of the turret. To mount inside the turret, we have 4 large fasteners, and the securing component is actually the front section that we have right here. If you notice, these parts here are threaded, and with the way it's designed is that this goes on, of course, the front of the vehicle. And then you have the fasteners, which go and they secure everything into their appropriate location. The turret armored section is just basically sandwiched in between, and everything is held firmly in place. Well, it looks like orientation is going to be more important for the installation than I mentioned before. You see, with the way the piece is designed, you have to first install everything from the outside in. This includes both the front cap section, as well as also with just the installation into the front trunnion. If you notice, this is the portion here that needs to emerge from the front armor plate here for the mantlet to connect onto it. It also needs to be able to fit inside this section. Obviously, that's not going to be the case. It needs to slide in this type of a format, and then like that, in order for you to then mount the securing lugs in their place and then secure them to the front of the armor plate. It's one of those things where you need to get the sequence just right. If not, you're going to run into some issues. Now, fortunately, this piece here wasn't too far along in terms of its components. I just went ahead and just remove these pieces temporarily. I don't need to re-add any grease to them because obviously I didn't take them out of the block. And in order to rethread them in, just a small little brush of Loctite is all that's going to be added for the reinstallation. But if I would have went further and installed all those other brackets that I'm going to be touching on later in this video, yeah, that would have been something that would have been pretty noteworthy, I should say. On the front rounded section, the piece is not symmetrical, so this is something to be aware of when it comes time for the installation. With the way I've checked it on the model that I have in the collection, as well as also with the instructions, the way you want is with the milled out section over here on the bottom. So I guess this gives you a little bit more of a depress. Anyway, so continuing with the mounting. Luckily, this part here is symmetrical, so this isn't really too important on how it fits in. Slide that in. I'm going to re-add the Loctite right here. Do that to both of these sections. And then just repeat the installation that I touched upon earlier. Well, I guess third time's a charm, because right after I went ahead and installed those fasteners from before, I decided to undo everything because I had the idea to replace the stock fasteners with countersunk fasteners. The original cap screws would have worked, but I think with the location of all the equipment, they may have been a bit too close to the fastener cap heads, which would have emerged from the brass. So in order to make things a little bit more streamlined, I went ahead and removed the brass sections, drilled out countersunks on the drill press, and then went ahead and cleaned them off, remounted them on with the grease and with the Loctite that I touched upon before. Now, I am quite confident that these pieces are permanently installed, and there's no need for me to undo this. So, knock on wood that that's the case. Okay, so with that finally resolved, it's time now to mount on the other brackets. So here's the interior now starting to take shape. The bracket that holds the limit switches as well as the recoil servo have been mounted, and the cam mount has been mounted as well. These get installed with the kit supplied markings with really no problems to be mentioned. You can also see, or hopefully you can see with this lighting here, how tight the confines are in these areas over here, which warranted the use of the countersinks that I touched upon before. Now, if you just use standard cap screws, you should again have the clearance required, but I felt a little bit more comfortable swapping those out with the countersinks that are present on this build. The next leg, or I should say the next bit of equipment that needs to be mounted, is the cam shaft. The cam block shaft itself, at the moment here, is stock. The only thing that I did to it was I added the primer coat that you can see here. Before I can mount this, though, I do need to make some modifications to the cam track itself. If anyone's a fan of my other Armortek content, and you've seen this bit of equipment in the other videos, you probably know what I'm going to be doing next. Here we have the actual cam itself, and if you notice, it fits on in a really snug and tight manner. Obviously, you want to have this piece have some movement and freedom so that it could go up and along the track here, which will make the motor move more efficiently and will work under less strain in order to operate with the elevation and with the depression. With the way it is here, it's going to be a little bit too tight, so I'm going to go ahead and widen the holes on both of these little oval cutouts that you see here. The procedure itself is extremely simple. All you need again is your Dremel with your sanding drum, and you're just going to go ahead and go up and down these surfaces here until you remove enough material for the cam to slide in effortlessly. It's a type of thing that goes by in a fairly quick manner, and when you accomplish it, you will know when you're all set. The drum itself fits in perfectly into this little slot over here, so there's not going to be a whole lot of guesswork when it comes time for the amount of material that needs to be removed. To show how easy it is, I'm actually going to do this one in real time. And there you go. You see the piece just slides right on in. It does move in a pretty fluid manner. I am going to remove just a slight bit amount of material before I go ahead and focus on the opposite side. Much better. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and refine the opposite side and then get this thing mounted to the vehicle. Before you can go ahead and get the unit secured, you need to mount on the brass lifting lug. The piece just drops directly into place, and you notice how freely the piece moves, of course, thanks to the material removal technique. But in order to secure it in permanently, there is a retention cap here with the screw. All this is kit supplied and goes on without any problems. Just a small little drop of Loctite and you're good to go. One thing I do want to point out though is with the orientation. You see this piece of course is reversible, but when you're securing it in place, you want to have the CNC side flush against the right hand side of this bracket, while you have the fastener on the reverse side. The reason why this is relevant is because of the tight confines on the inside portion of the turret. With the camera readjusted, you can see what I was referring to. That bracket's going to go into this area over here, and that brass section is going to be moving up and down in relevance to the barrel's trunnion. Well, if you have that portion with the fastener found on this side, it can possibly strike the fasteners that secure the bracket in place. So by mounting it in this type of format here, it is a lower profile and you're not going to have any risk of it striking any sort of the equipment found here on the trunnion itself. Another thing you need to do prior to this being mounted into the tank is you need to secure this to the elevation motor itself. The motor components consist of the bracket as well as the large threaded shaft portion that we have here. The pieces are all bolted together assembly and they all go together without any problems. One thing I want to mention though is one change, and this is a change that I typically do on these builds, is with the fastener choice for the threaded rod. The kit supplies you with a grub set screw type fastener, which is one of those Allen bolts that are flush with the exterior portion of the material. And this is what's used to thread and lock onto the flat that's found on the motor's gearbox. This does work, however, you'll notice I replaced that with a standard cap screw. This is, again, one technique that I like to incorporate on these Armorteks, because with the grub screws, one problem that they have is that they tend to strip out very quickly and without a whole lot of torque. So if you want to crank down on this shaft over here because you don't want it to wiggle or get loose on you, the replacement of the grub with a cap screw is one that is very easily done. All you gotta do is just swap out the bolt and you're good to go. With the location that this piece is located in, you're gonna see that it makes absolutely no contact with any of the other fasteners or other bits of equipment found on this piece. And of course, needless to say, Loctite is used for all of the fasteners, but that goes without saying for just about every single bolt and nut that's found on this kit here. The thread shaft itself has a little bit of surface rust on it, not a big deal, a few drops of oil, and I'm going to go ahead and massage that in. But before I do that, I could go ahead and thread this unit in place. Now, on the lug itself, you'll notice that there are two sides. This side here has a dimple that is milled into it, and this dimple is for ease of threading the piece on, like we see here. It will thread in the reverse direction, but really this is the way it's supposed to be connected. Once the unit is threaded on, this is basically the appearance that you get. I am going to add a little bit of grease to the threads as well as to the cam surface over here, which will just give a little bit more efficiency for the unit to operate. Right now there is some oil found on the threads, again due to the surface rust that I mentioned just earlier. Okay, so with this now fully assembled, I could go ahead and mount this bracket inside of the vehicle. After that, we'll then secure the motor to the turret. And once that's done, well, the elevation system is basically completed with the exception of these limit switches here that I'll touch upon in a moment. So here we have the motor bracket and the elevation mount secured to the model permanently. The next step is to secure the motor, of course, to the bottom portion of the turret. And that's facilitated with this little bracket that we have here. This is the kit supplied bracket. It's just made from a CNC'd aluminum bar that has been pre-drilled out. All the holes line up, but however, there is an interesting quirk found with this generation of kit. And that is if I line up the holes and I line up the motor mount, they go on in a pretty straightforward manner. Nothing really much to talk about there, but well, actually, let me go ahead and bring the camera over so you see exactly what I mean. Okay, with the camera readjusted, this should get a better idea. These four holes secure this bar to the lower portion of the turret, and the turret has four holes that are drilled and tapped in the material. So the fasteners go in without any problems. The other four fasteners, well, they're to secure the motor mount to the bracket. But what's interesting is with these two that we have right here. See, with these two, they're just basically out in the open, so you just secure with a nut on the opposite end, and you're good to go. You're supposed to do the same thing with these two here, but you can clearly see there's a bit of a problem. And that is that the bottom portion here of the turret is flush on the bottom of the bracket. Because of this, you cannot secure these two holes with the fasteners that are supplied, unless you do a slight modification to them. The modification that I made was on the reverse side. You'll notice that on these two holes here, I actually bored them out wider and deeper compared to the other holes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to secure the motor mount bracket to this bar with those two fasteners, but they're going to be bolted to the bar itself. I'm going to use the kit supply fasteners, as well as two M4 nuts, thread everything in place, lock time in where they need to go, trim off any excess material that descends from the bar, and then from that point there, I could secure this to the tank with the kit supply method. For fasteners over here, threaded into the lower portion itself, and the other two are going to be using the kit supply fasteners, but with the external nuts. By securing this manner, you get all four of the fasteners holding this bracket in place permanently and securely, but without having any need to drill into the lower portion. This is extremely important, and I can't stress that enough because of the stress and the forces that are going to be exhibited on this bracket. Notice Armortek themselves utilize a fairly thick piece of aluminum for this. This is about half an inch thick, so it's got some substantial thickness to it, and this is because all of the weight of the barrel, as well as all of the motion of the barrel, is going to be resting literally on this block of aluminum. If this was thinner, and it had some flex to it, the piece is going to bend before the barrel goes up or down. So having the bracket held on with only 2 fasteners is not going to be suffice for this type of procedure. So you need all 4, and this is so far the best and least I should say the least invasive way in order to secure it. In order to drill these out, I just took a wider drill bit, threw it on the drill press, and just carefully bored these 2 sections out. You want to set the depth on your drill press so you don't accidentally over drill into the piece, and if you do, you're basically screwed at that point. So with that in mind, these holes are now drilled, and I can go ahead and get everything mounted securely. So just before I mount the motor to the turret, here you can see the bracket with those fastener mods that I mentioned before. The 2 bolts are firmly attached with Loctite, and I went ahead and just trimmed off the extending section of the threads with the Dremel. With those off, the next step is to go ahead and secure this plate to the turret bottom, and then I could just wrap it up by finishing the other 2 fasteners that are required. Well, after a few turns of a wrench, the motor is now firmly attached to the bracket, which in turn is firmly attached to the bottom of the turret. The elevation system at this point is basically completed, with the exception of the limit switches that we have here, and these are going to be mounted to the side bracket. As per the instructions over here, this one is a little bit different compared to some of the other older generation Armorteks that I've built. Specifically ones that use the limit switch. Usually you have one limit switch placed on the top and the other one placed on the bottom. And this works so that when the barrel overextends in one direction, it triggers it, and vice versa. What's unique about this one here is that apparently this one works where you have both of the switches that are going to interact with the floor of the turret, and this should give you the same exact results, give or take. It's going to be interesting to see how that pans out, but, you know, the video is young, or not really at this point, but regardless, I'm going to go ahead and mount them with the kit direction, and then we're going to go ahead and give it a test run. With the turret back into the other shop, I was able to put it onto the vehicle and patch the electronics into the RC system. I was also able to briefly test it, and I have mostly good news. The unit does plug in, and it operates absolutely flawlessly with the out-of-the-box configuration. However, I did encounter one small hiccup that to me was not necessarily surprising, but it could be in case you're building one of these era of King Tigers and you stumble upon this portion of the build. And that is with the limit switches. Like I stated before, in the instructions, the limit switches are intended to be pointed downward, and this will give you the limits for both the elevation as well as the depression. Well, in testing, that's not the case. It's actually as per the standard Armortek systems of the era, where you need to have one of the prongs pointing upward and the other one pointing downward. Why this was mentioned in the instruction in the opposite manner, that's information that I honestly can't tell you. But it's a simple thing to accommodate for. All you gotta do is one of the limit switches, you gotta have to point downward, and the other one you just bolt in the upward direction. It's an easy thing to configure, and once configured, your elevation system is pretty much done. To test the system out, currently the tank and the radio are both powered on, and if I move the allocated channel left and right, this will both elevate or depress the main gun. If I take the limit switches here and trigger one of them, the motor can only go in one direction. I'm currently hitting the action, as you can see, it's not working. But if I let go, the unit will function. Same thing, by the way, vice versa. That's me hitting the radio. As soon as I let go, oop, that would have been the motors powering up. Anyway, oop, if I let go, now, if I try using the stock trick, where if both of them are depressed, you will see that the system is just totally dead and won't work in either direction. So, again, because of this, I am going to go ahead and use the same system, but in order to do so, I am going to mount them in this type of a format, where we have one toggle on the top and the other one on the bottom. These are going to fasten to this plate here as per the kit, and we'll see what that looks like once everything is finally mounted. The most important thing to keep in mind, though, is to know which of these limit switches here are for the top restriction and the bottom restriction, because you don't want to mix those up for obvious reasons. So here we have the first limit switch mounted in place, and if I test it, right now the switch is bottomed out, so the circuit is dead, but if I go in the reverse direction, it's going to work until it bottoms out. This is important to do where you have to go and install these one at a time, because you need to configure them individually. This is the easiest way to go through the motion, because it is going to take a fair bit amount of tweaking and bending on the spoons in order to get them to a portion that you're satisfied with. One of the tricks with this is you need to have the switch bottom out at just the right time. If you have it bottomed out at a certain point, you'll probably have some more threads on here, and if you have the bent in a certain direction, it's not going to bottom out at all, which will cause overextension. So you need to find a nice little happy medium. On this one here, if you listen closely, you'll hear the click of the cherry switch when it depresses. So pick that up. Okay, if you didn't, I'm going to go in the reverse direction, and you will hear it click, and then the motor will immediately shut off. Right there. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and bring the camera in closer so you get to see the type of bend I was able to achieve with this unit here. When it comes to bending these cherry switches, this is something that you're going to, again, need to go through some trial and error for. This took me quite a few attempts, and if you try a few different types of geometries on the bend, it's going to yield for some less desirable results. As for which result is best, well, again, this is done by trial and error. Honestly, I've done so many of these builds right now, and if you compare the cherry switch layout, no two are really alike. So each vehicle in this regard is an individual. So this is something to keep in mind of if you're working on a vehicle with this type of a setup. With any luck, with the lighting situation that I have here, hopefully everything's in focus and you can see the weird zigzag bend I was able to bend into the metal in order to get it to the appropriate shape. One thing that's nice about these cherry switches is that the levers are pretty resilient and can bend with relative ease using either your hands or a needle nose plier. They are fairly robust, so you can bend them back and forth a number of times before eventually the metal will snap, but there is a finite amount of times that you can bend the metal on these. So you want to do a lot of testing and make sure you're bending them in the right direction before you commit to something that can possibly lead to some bad results. If doomsday happens and one of the spoons does crack off, you're not completely screwed. These cherry switches are very easily obtainable and are extremely affordable. Or you can also solder onto the spoon itself with a little bit of brass. So if any screw up does happen, you're not completely up the creek without a paddle. Well, with this one done, I'm going to go ahead and mount on the top version, and then we'll be able to get the elevation system put to rest. And here's the setup with the second limit switch now mounted. For this one, you'll notice that it required a little bit more modifications in order to mount compared to the one on the bottom. Where the one on the bottom, all I had to do was bend the spoon in a weird certain format in order to achieve the result. For this one here, I had to add a little bit of more extra material. With the way the turret is shaped on the front of the King Tiger here, if I grab the turret roof and mount it on or put it close to it, you'll see exactly how much space is remaining from the top portion of the lever to the bottom portion here of the turret roof. Because of that, if you just try to mount it in place without any alterations, you're not going to be able to reach the roof panel, and it's going to lead for some problems. Like I stated earlier, one advantage that this system has is that it's extremely easy to solder to. So in order to extend it, all I did was I took a little strip of 1/2 inch thick, or wide I should say, brass strip, soldered it to the top portion here of the lever, and then I was able to bend it to any sort of configuration that achieved the result. If I put the turret on, you're going to hear the part click in place. Right now, the unit is bottomed out and would prevent the barrel from overextending. Also, with the way I have it calibrated, it's really at the very tail end of the slot here found on the cam. So with the way the unit is configured, I am utilizing all of the cam surface without any point where the system will shut off prematurely. So the elevation depression that's going to be on this model is going to be the max that you're going to get with this setup. Of course, this is going to warrant a test of the system. One other thing I want to point out is that if you're doing the system, you have to make sure that the lever is bent to a point where it hits the top of the roof and shuts off before the top roof can move. On this model here, the roof is going to be removable via a magnet type system, so if the unit was so powerful where it pops the roof off in order for it to shut off, that is something that's less than ideal, and again, it requires just a little bit of tweaking to get it to this point. Okay, with the turret on, let's go ahead and elevate. Hopefully you heard that click. It's not working in that direction anymore, so now let me go ahead and reverse direction and depress the system. Well, as you can see, the elevation system is working absolutely perfectly. It's a nice smooth system, and it is bottoming out at the max on both the elevation as well as on the depression. Also, you'll notice that the top panel did not move a single inch when the unit bottomed out on it. From here, this is literally a perfect calibration, and we can progress further with the remainder of the build. With the barrel elevation system fully assembled and mounted into the model, the next step is to work on the main tube itself. The tube, like I said before, is basically ready to go out of the box. The only thing that I am going to do to it is to remove, or I should say flush away, some of those fine CNC marks that I touched upon earlier. You can hear it, hopefully, from me rubbing my finger up and down the grooves. This is something I'm just going to polish down with some sandpaper. I'm going to be using two types of grits. I'm going to start with 150 and then go up to 400. This should be more than enough to go ahead and refine this any further. This is important, in my opinion, or it's not necessarily super important, but it helps the build, in my opinion, two areas. First, it refines the machine work on the tube itself, making it more smoother compared to it being left original. But also on this section over here, it's pretty important because this is where the recoil animation is going to take effect. The tolerances are pretty tight already on some of the parts, and so I'm going to loosen them up by removing some material on the nylon itself, as well as also by buffing down some of these ridges here. This too will help in that regard. So from here, I'm just going to go ahead and turn the pieces on the lathe. The lathe is just going to be a good way to ensure that the sanding is done in a nice, even manner. However, I got to point out, this is actually a fairly risky procedure because some things can go wrong. If the piece is not in the chuck in a strong manner, it can pop off on you, and if this thing's spinning fast, you just don't want that to happen. The second thing is, because of the length of it, you're going to be putting some leverage on this portion over here, potentially, just with going up and down the surfaces, and this too can cause the piece to break away from the chuck. Again, neither which is really ideal. For the speeds, I'm actually going to be going at a medium to a slow speed, so if anything like that does happen, it's mitigated by, I could instantly just, slam on the stop button, which will prevent or mitigate the damage that can occur. But again, if you do not have this tool, or if you just are not comfortable with using this machine, you could just do the same procedure by hand, going up and down the surfaces. Granted, it's going to take you a little bit longer, but it is a safer bet than using this machine here. But since I have the tooling and I've done this a number of times, I'm pretty confident I should be able to pull it off. Well, after not a whole lot of time on the lathe with those two grits of sandpaper, you can see what the tube looks like now that it has been refined. Those little CNC mill marks are buffed away. If I go up and down the tube here, you're not exactly going to hear the same type of noise that were found on the tube sections previously. The one thing I am going to touch upon right now, though, is at this point that we have here. With the way the piece is machined, I guess they must have a machine that it mills it out to this point, then it flips it around, and then mills out the remainder. Because of this, you are going to have this small little segment here where the two halves are very close to lining up, but not quite there. It's really negligible. Most people will just paint over it and they'll be fine with it. But for this one here, I'm going to go ahead and polish away even further. The way this is going to be done is just with some red putty. I'm just going to put a little smear on that section over there and then just polish it down by hand. That's basically all that needs to be done. So I'm just going to let this set, hit it with some fine sandpaper, and then the tube here is ready for the next step. With the barrel set aside so the putty can dry, it's now time to jump on the muzzle. The muzzle, like I said before, is a single piece of CNC turning and will give you the overall look and feel of the King Tiger's muzzle, which is again what we typically expect on these kits. But to take it to the next level, I went ahead and marked some areas with a Sharpie that I'm going to go ahead and add some revisions to. Basically, the sections here at the baffle are going to be carved out to give it more of a slant type appearance. The wrench slits found in the front are going to be milled along with the wrench slits found on the retention ring. The standard tombstone shaped locking pin section is going to be fabricated as well. And finally, one thing that's not seen here are the baffle ring sections that are found on the center divive. All this is going to be fabricated out of either pieces of plastic, namely the center divide, but other than that, I'm just going to be cutting into the aluminum, giving for the appropriate sections that I just touched upon. Here you can see one of the angle cuts that have been added. This was done freehand with the Dremel. I have here a small high-speed removal bit. This does work extremely well. The aluminum that this part is made in is not super hard, so the bit actually does some fairly quick work of it. However, after prolonged use, obviously it's going to start dulling the hell out of this bit here, so this is going to be a sacrificial type thing. So if you're going to go with this type of a setup, make sure that you have a few of these on hand, and after, once they're, burned out, you can just simply pitch them. But at least they were able to do the job. I'm going to go ahead and just do the one here on the opposite side, just to show how easy this material cuts away. As you can see, the material gets removed in a short order. The biggest trick when doing this is you need to make sure that you try to make it as symmetrical as possible. So from time to time, you'll see me checking both sides, see how this turns out. If it is slightly off symmetry, I could go ahead and just adjust accordingly with the Dremel. I've basically done this technique so many times now that honestly it's basically second nature at this point. But if you're doing this for the first time, just take your time and you should be able to yield similar results. And after a little bit of elbow grease, here you can see what the brake looks like, fully completed, and at this point it's ready for painting and mounting to the rest of the tube. On the top portion you can see the locking tab. Here you can see the wrench slits that were added to the retention nut. And on the inside here I recycled one of my resin retention nuts for my Tiger 1 muzzle section that is a resin casting that is offered on the ECA catalog. On the front portion, we have two other little notches cut in, which are, again, for wrench slits. And the baffles I already touched upon earlier. Just by tweaking the kit piece in a few key locations is really all that's needed in order to make it shine and to improve upon what the kit already gives you. From here, the piece will just, like I stated before, just be threaded into its appropriate location without any issues. On the main tube itself, at this point here, you can see the sanding work that was done on that section that I mentioned before. And at this point, this fella here is also ready for painting. With the elevation out of the way and it's fully functional, the next thing to do is to focus on the recoil system. However, this is going to require me to do some other tasks before I can get to this bit of equipment here. This is going to be discussed in more depth in the next video update. However, one other thing I could mention involves the recoil module box. This unit here I'm going to mount in the turret, and this is generally the locations that I mount these systems. The reason why I mount them in the turret involves a close proximity to the equipment that is found for the remainder of the recoil system, namely the LED flash cord. This needs, of course, to be plugged into this box over here, and if you have this in the hull, it's going to lead to some issues. In order to mount it into the turret, however, there is going to be one slight tweak that needs to be made, and that involves the main cables. You see, the cables that come with the model are decent in length, however, in my opinion, they're a bit too short. In order to stretch them out, I went ahead and a number of years ago I picked up these extender cords from AliExpress. The link is listed below in the video description in case anyone wants to add this little bit of accessory to your builds. In my opinion, these are an excellent bit of equipment to add because it gives you just more room over here and allows the unit to be plugged into the turret and have plenty of cord in order for the turret to rotate in any way it will. The units just simply drop directly into place. No other conversion, soldering, or any other type of electrical work needs to be done. Just clip them in and you're good to go. With the main tube assembly assembled, I went ahead and temporarily fitted it back to the turret along with its mantlet over here in order to test the elevation system. You need to do this because although the system will work just fine without the tube present, once you add these components here, this can change the operation. This is specifically true with vehicles where you have a really long barrel and even compounded by vehicles that have a muzzle brake on the end. It's basic physics, you know, you have this type of leverage going on, and on the inside here there's really nothing to counterbalance that. And this is true for vehicles like the Stalin, possibly the M4A3E8 Sherman, the Panther, but it's specifically true for these German tanks, where you have these really crazy long barrels, and you have that big, like fist-sized muzzle brake on the end. On some of the earlier Armortek kits, specifically ones with the blank system installed, this is less of a concern because you have that gigantic mass of aluminum in the turret, and that will counterbalance, of course, the long barrel that you see here. But for this one here, or vehicles without that system installed, this is something that can possibly be an issue. Now, if you do have this type of a issue happening with your build, fear not, this is something that can be addressed by the addition of springs found on the inside, and this is something that I've done on several other builds in the past. This one probably is going to get the same procedure, but before I go ahead and just commit to that, let's go ahead and test the elevation system to see if it's even necessary. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on the tank. Okay, so let's go ahead and elevate and depress the tube. This, by the way, is more of a thing when the tube is going upward, obviously. Going downward, you're not going to really have much of an issue. So I'm just going to wait till it bottoms out. Okay. Now, on some occasions, if you bottom it out, this is where the motor will be at its most strain because you're going to have to really force the section up. When it's in the middle, it's not as much of a pressing issue. So to test it, you want to bottom it out and then raise it. So, okay, it's bottomed out. You can hear the motor going. And it's doing its job. Okay, and that's it maxed out. The motor is not, I wouldn't say it's strained, but you can definitely hear that it's under some load. So for this one here, I still am going to do the spring counterbalance trick, but this is going to be done after the recoil animation is fully assembled and is calibrated. But so far, this is actually really good. Because like I say, on some builds I've seen it where the motor is just not having it. It's like I'm under too much stress, guys. I need some help. This one here, it's up for the job, but I'm just going to make the motor's life a little bit easier by adding some springs. But more information on that is to come. And in case anyone is wondering, John, why isn't the recoil system patched in at this point? I mean, you did the elevation system, the tube detailing is all set, and he said that the mantlet was pretty good. Well, the mantlet itself is really, really good, but it needs one or two small little tweaks in order to get it up to the point of installation. But the real reason why I haven't fitted this piece on yet involves the front plate area. The front plate area needs to be tweaked a little bit compared to the way we see it here. First, the trunnion ball system. This is actually pretty visible on this pattern of vehicle, so these fastener location holes need to go, and I believe there's also some weld bead detailing that needs to be sculpted in this area here. The other thing that needs to be taken care of at this point is the deletion of the fastener location holes. These got to be polished away with a little bit of bodywork, and then once it's all set, I could then drop the mantlet in place. Also, in case anyone's wondering why we have this huge hole here on the front, this is actually for the coaxial machine gun, and spoiler alert, Armortek does give you the insert piece, and it's just going to drop directly into place, but it is going to require a little bit of body work in order to flare everything in. All this information, of course, is going to be discussed in more depth in the next video update. Well, clearly this is a huge step now out of the way. Basically, almost all of the stock original functions are completed at this point, and I'm beginning to run out of parts that are remaining in the boxes in order to flesh this one out. So, and also, most importantly, without question, we all know what this vehicle is by taking a quick glance at it. It is obviously a King Tiger, and it's beginning to really start filling into that type of expectation. One other thing I want to mention is that this vehicle's weight is not going to increase all that much more from this point here. With that in mind, this is actually the perfect time to take this vehicle out for a test drive. It's been a while since this model here was able to churn up some dirt, and since then, the vehicle's weight has increased immensely from all of the electrical and mechanical components that have been fitted to the vehicle since then. Not to mention, of course, the giant elephant in the room, quite literally being the turret that we have sitting on top of this vehicle. With all of these pieces of equipment now fitted, the vehicle needs to be driven because, one, it's fun to do, but most importantly, it's because all this added weight can change the track tension that's found on the vehicle. If the track tension needs to be adjusted, this is the point to do it in, as opposed to when the model's fully completed, painted, and weather, and you're driving in the field, and next thing you know, bink, you go ahead and pop a track. Not exactly a fun time indeed. So, don't be surprised within the next either in the next video or the video following it, this bad boy here is going to be doing some laps. And with that, that wraps up this project update video for this 1/6 scale Armortek radio-controlled German King Tiger heavy tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being 1/6 scale project update videos like this one over here, or the smaller scale model showcase videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build that have been posted since the project start, along with the other smaller and larger scale builds that are showcased on this channel. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by EastCoastArmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Catch you all on the next one. See you later.